Well, good morning and welcome. We are glad you're here. We're glad you are a part of the first ever, the inaugural i2ED conference. Well, we thought quite a bit about this idea of what our keynote might look like. How do we want to start this i2ED idea? How do we find somebody that really captures the idea of what i2ED is all about? Somebody who could set the standard for the keynotes that would come after this. We thought hard about somebody who really embodies this idea of 21st century skills. What do students of tomorrow need to look like? Who is someone who can demonstrate that information today? We wanted i2ED to be different, not the kind of status quo. We didn't want to get somebody who's been kind of ingrained in what education has looked like for the past who knows how many years to tell us more about that, but rather somebody who could look at it a little bit from the outside, but also who understood education. Not a lot of people that really fit that mold, but I think that we found one. I think you're going to agree with me that we found one. We have with us this morning the CEO of Contrax Furnishings, Mr. Bill Latham. Mr. Latham is someone that I've been very impressed with him individually, with his company. He, as an individual, really embodies this idea of what 21st century skills are all about, and I think you'll see that this morning. I had the good pleasure to go spend a few days with him. We traveled all over the state of Florida looking at some innovative schools throughout Florida, had good opportunities to have some great conversation about education, and what I saw was an individual who is passionate about education for the right reasons, someone who has a vision for what reform should look like. He'll talk to you about this idea of high impact learning environments and what we can do to change the environment in which students find themselves in terms of education, and someone who's willing to do the hard work to work for positive change in education. So, who is Bill Latham? Well, he's a trained chemist, worked in chemistry for several years, has 3 patents to his name, and then decided, you know what? Life is about change, and this is not what I want to do for the rest of my life. Went back to school and got his MBA, became an entrepreneur. It went from chemistry and having patents in chemistry to an entrepreneur working in the educational realm. He bought and took over a small regional furnishing company and has grown that over the course of a short time exponentially to a nationwide distributor. And someone who's not just about distributing furniture, but someone who's about really sitting down with schools and working with them to say, what should education look like and how can the environment that you create impact that? That's a pretty cool opportunity. Hopefully you read his bio on our website. It's pretty impressive. What you won't read about that on the bio is that he's actually a world champion in Taekwondo. He's a family man. He's an individual who's passionate about education, passionate about his business, and he's here to talk to you this morning, Mr. Bill Latham.
Well, good morning. I'm very, very pleased to be here, Eli. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your inaugural conference. I think Morgan Freeman was tied up, and so I was a second choice, I think, but very glad to be here nonetheless. A note about being in Taekwondo. It's very similar, I think, to where we find ourselves in education. There's always room for improvement. I just competed in the World Championships this weekend, and I did well in some of the events, but in one particular, which is a weapons form event where I was using a nunchuck. For those of you who aren't familiar, it's a completely useless weapon that you would never pull out if you needed to against an assailant. I actually threw the weapon 30 feet by accident into another ring. And the judges actually had to confer as to how many points were deducted for throwing it out of the ring, because normally you would just drop it. And as it turns out, I asked the judge after the round, I said, have you ever seen that before? And he said, no, I've never seen anything like that, but I've only been doing this 20 years. So as it turns out, we always have room for improvement, and that's what I want you to kind of walk away this morning with a sense of, is the nature of what we face, I think, in education. I think the true goal of education is to develop a lifelong learner. You realize that you're different than the person that you were when you were coming through school, and you will likely be different yet again at some iteration in your life. I had the fortune of moving from chemistry to educational furniture over time. When I run into people I went to college with, they'll say, "What are you doing now?" I say, "I sell school furniture," and they'll tap me on the shoulder and say, "Man, sometimes life just doesn't work out the way you think it's going to." And I agree with them, and just kind of move on. But this is the goal, I believe, of education, is to develop people who have a passion for lifelong learning, because they're going to have to do that as the nature of employment it changes in the future. I think it's important, and I love this quote from Albert Einstein, that we formulate our problems correctly or our opportunities correctly. If we don't understand the nature of what we're facing, then oftentimes our solution sets will not reflect the nature of what we're facing. Too many times we have a knee-jerk reaction to an acute problem without understanding how it fits in context. And so I'd like us to begin this morning on this journey of how did we arrive with the education system that we have currently and the challenges that we face. And we're going to go to the most logical starting point I could think of, and that would be the British Empire. Now, how many of you know much about the British Empire at its height? This was the last of the great empires, right? In the age of empires, a 350-year span in the British Empire, 22.6% of the world's landmass was at one time controlled under the British Empire, 458 million people, 20% of the world's population. And they ran this empire for 350 years successfully, and they did it with no computers, no email, no anything, right? How did they do that? I mean, I can't imagine running my schedule in a week without my iPhone. I have many panic attacks when I can't find where's my phone, right? And so how did they do this? Well, they did this by inventing a global computer. It was a human computer, not a computer like what we use now, and they did it using ships and pieces of paper. And these ships and pieces of paper would travel all over the world. And the idea behind their computer was that they needed spare parts for the computer that would function properly no matter where they put them in the computer. So if I was in New Zealand, I needed to be able to move that spare part to Canada and have it function correctly. And there were three things that you had to do very well if you were going to be a functioning part of this global human computer. The first thing you needed to be able to do well is you needed to be able to read in English. The second thing you needed to be able to do was write in English. And the third thing you needed to be able to do was computations in your head and on paper beautifully. Guess where our 3 R's come from? These were things that were necessary components to exist in this global computer. Now, we understand that the age of empires is over, but we'll see some things that are still left over from this culture that was developed that's in our DNA now in education. The first thing we'll find is that the purpose of education in the British Empire was to do what? It was to teach them to run the empire, to be good citizens of England. Not necessarily to be intelligent, not necessarily to be accomplished, but to be good managers of the empire, good citizens. And so their education system was geared toward giving them common experiences, common opportunities, boyhood experiences to be philosopher kings that ran the empire. So it was important that they have consistency in their education system. The second thing was, when you are the British Empire, you want everyone to know England. Now, I'm in martial arts, as you know, and we walk into the dojo on any given day, and my instructor will say, do this, go wax the car, go sand the floor, and 3 weeks later, he'll put all these concepts together, and all of a sudden, I'm doing karate, right? And the instructor is prized for that information. He knows how to get the student, the individual student, from point A to point Z, and it's not necessarily laid out cleanly in a curriculum. And so in Eastern teaching, it's very prized. The teacher is very prized. But if you're the British Empire, do you want the Indian local teacher teaching children Indian culture? No, you don't, because we're making the world England. And in order to minimize the influence of the local teacher, we develop curriculum, content. And the content is delivered in such a way that I minimize that local influence. And so I get a consistent, controlled content delivery. The second thing is I can minimize that local influence, and the theory is then I produce a very predictable output, right? And so our textbook culture, and some of that's changing, but our textbook culture is heavily driven by controlling content. I've even heard the term teacher-proofing the classroom. As if any education system can exist and rise above the level of its teachers. And so we have to understand this is kind of a leftover concept of producing what? Citizens and people that are consistent. The other piece in the Age of Empires that was important was the examination culture. If I was going to send you to New Zealand and you were going to go run the colony, could I be under any illusion that I would pick up the phone and ask you next week, how is it going? No. I had to know that you knew England. And I had to test those things that I could actually test. There's so many things I couldn't test, but I had to develop things that I could test that would tell me that you knew England. And as your ship disappeared over the horizon, I had great faith that you were going to go bring England to New Zealand. And so we find that the examination culture was heavily, heavily practiced in this Age of Empires. But here's the question. Are we in the Age of Empires anymore? No, we're not. And so these pieces of leftover DNA that exist in our system today, I believe we really need to start thinking and challenging. And many of the things that you will talk about in the next couple of days at this conference, I hope will challenge you at the core in these areas. Well, let's move from the Age of Empires to what do I need today? Now, I don't know as much about education as I probably should. I mean, I were educated in Florida, and I is a in the arena of education. But when I look at the soft skills that are necessary for workers who are coming into the 21st century workplace, what we see is a fairly significant disconnect with what we need and what is produced. And so I want to talk to you for just a minute about what I consider to be 7 soft skills, very essential soft skills for a 21st century worker. Because as we're making preparation of these students to enter the work world, we need to ask ourselves, are they developing these type of skills? Does our education system support the development of these type of skills? So let's look. The first one, and you'll find this probably number 1 or 2 on every list that you can Google on the internet, is critical thinking and problem solving. You never just have one job at a company anymore. Whatever your particular job is, you also usually participate in continuous improvement in that company. You participate in the quality systems of that company, as well as whatever it is you do. I like to think of Toyota. If you're never just a line assembly person with Toyota, you can actually stop the line at any point in time if you see a quality defect, and you're required to participate in continuous improvement teams as part of your employment there. So critical thinking and problem solving are things that would be highly prized as an employer and a necessary 21st century skill. The next one is collaborating across networks. In other words, being able to lead by influence across a network. Think about it this way. It used to be you had the job title, and this is the boss, and boss would tell you what to do, and that's how we got things done. It doesn't really work that way anymore. You put teams of people together who have different titles in different places, and they actually have to network together and lead by influence, not by title. It's a skill set that you learn to participate in a group and to bring value to the group and therefore gain influence over the thinking of the group. A third skill set is actually being entrepreneurial, taking initiative. How many of you love working with somebody that doesn't take any initiative? That's a real blast. Teenagers? Yeah, I enjoy that. I've got a 14-year-old now, one who's on the cusp of being 13, and, biggest complaint in life is that he has to do work around the house. Yeah? So initiative is one of those things that we're looking for people to come in and not just say, okay, this is the way it is, but how can we change and better the situation? How can we put our program forward? The fourth one I would suggest would be agility, adaptability. Department of Labor estimates that today's graduating high school student will hold between 10 and 14 jobs by age 38. How many different technology systems is that they'll work with? 10 to 14. How many different contexts will they be in those jobs? How agile and adaptable do they have to be? Not just to technology, but to its application as a tool. It's an extremely different type of workforce. Then we look at effective oral and written communication skills. And I have to tell you, I have a pet peeve with the word like and its improper application in the English language. I'm horrified sometimes by the level of written and oral communication that our young people today bring into the workplace. People who are very intelligent, highly educated, and when I read their emails, it's embarrassing for them. I actually have a nephew, he's 19 now, but when he was 17, he and a friend joined a family gathering in Savannah, Georgia, and we had them all weekend, and this friend of his was a lacrosse player, and he was a lacrosse player, and like was in every single sentence that they used, 2 and 3 times in some cases. So I had them for 4 days, and I thought, I'm going to try a concept. And so I started using 3 great motivators, I call them, fear, sarcasm, and ridicule, to try to get the young men to stop using the word. And after 4 days, they were turning on each other by the end of the 4 days. Is it like that, or is it actually that way? And so from that, I had a whole internet concept. I was going to name it Ridicule U, University. And the 3 great pillars there were fear, sarcasm, and ridicule. You know, I will take your teenager, and for a week, I will work with them, and they will come back, and they will speak more intelligently. And it never went anywhere. That was a big bomb. I ended up in furniture after that. So, never before has the sum total of human facts been at our fingertips quite as easily as it is today. How high is the Great Wall of China? What would you do? I just Google it, right? I don't need to know it's 6.5 to 8 meters. That's just in case information that's only important if you play Trivial Pursuit. And that game is very historic now. But the idea is that being able to analyze and assess the information that is there and critically work through that information to validate the information before making application of it is a skill. It's not enough to be able to go find information about something. You need to be able to validate the information that's there, and you need to be able then to make application of it, trusting that it is good source. And so the analyzing of information is extremely important. And then the last thing is curiosity and imagination. Now, this is not hard for us to see in kindergartners, is it? Kindergarten classroom, how do we move the elephant from this side of the river to this side of the river? How many hands go up? All of them. And how many ideas does each child have? 2, 3. And they're great ideas. By the time they're in 4th or 5th grade, if we ask that question, how many hands will go up? 3 or 4? And everyone else in the class will do what as they share their ideas? We'll tell them why that doesn't work, why that won't work. And by the time they're in high school, they're irritated that you're even asking the question. I don't care about moving the elephant. How does this, benefit me, right? So the idea is somehow we manage to beat curiosity and imagination out of people in 12 years. And by the time we get them in the workforce, honestly, there's some reforming that has to go on to re-engage or get a pilot light started oftentimes for be curious about what we do. Imagine the possibilities. Create. These are soft skills that I'm looking for every day as an employer, and it's like looking in a desert sometimes. So we have to ask ourselves, what can we do about that? Well, let's think about it this way. If we looked at the graduation rates in high school in the 60s, the United States actually led the world in graduation rates. Woo-hoo! Yeah? And the good news is, since 1960, the graduation rate in the United States has improved. But you know what else has happened? The rest of the world has caught up. And we no longer lead the world in graduation rates. We're actually 6th or 7th. And let me ask you this, does graduation rate tell you much about the preparedness of the students to enter college or to enter the workforce? Not really. But there is an assessment, I believe, that does. How many of you are familiar with the PISA test? Program for International Student Assessment. We'll talk about it for just a minute then. So the PISA test was organized in 1997. 70 industrialized countries take their 15-year-olds and they take a test in math and science and reading. And the objective of the test is to test critical thinking skills. So it's not a test that says, what's the Pythagorean formula or how do you find X? It's actually going to assume you know the Pythagorean formula, and it's going to put you in a situation that you've never seen before. And you're going to have to make application of things that you know and pull together. A math question might be something like, design your own currency for your country, tell me how it works and why. And you actually have to write lines to answer your math question. You can get full credit for a math question on the test by applying the proper methodology, even if you mess up the calculation. So the test is really geared toward critical thinking and problem solving. Again, just one of the soft skills I've talked about, but a very important one. You'll find it on everybody's list near the top. Now, how does the U.S. perform against other nations? Well, these words are too small for you to see. Kind of by design. But at the top here, and I did cheat on the scale here. You'll notice the scale gets really wide in the middle, so it won't look as bad for us in the United States when we get to it. But up here in the top, this is the proficiency rating, 60 to 80%, and we find countries like Korea and Finland, Shanghai, in this kind of purple. By the way, I have a red-green color deficiency, so if I call it gray, 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 and gray, you'll know. Yeah. So in this sort of gray, supposed to be purpley area, this is countries like Japan and Canada and France. And then somewhere down here in the 30% proficiency range on this test, we find Poland and the Czech Republic, and right below that, the U.S. average. But it's not fair to look at the U.S. as a homogeneous education population, because it's not. So looking at states, because states tend to be much more individualistic in their approaches to education, I think is a more sensible way to look at this data. So we're going to look at a map here in just a moment that shows how the states perform in the United States. And I want this group to guess just for a moment how many of our states perform in the 60 to 80% range. Any guesses? 3? Zero. Not one. In fact, when we look at the map, we'll find there are very few states that perform even in that second tier. And mind you, the second tier is only 40 to 50% proficiency. And here we are in the state of Texas, education system in the state of Texas. I'm from Texas, by the way. I love Texas. I live in Florida now. My dad was in the Air Force. Moved 16 times before I graduated from high school, so once I finally got planted, I didn't move a lot. But the state of Texas actually performs as 15-year-olds in the Czech Republic. Yugoslavia, as it were, in the Eastern Bloc. In California, we see students performing as they do in Greece. And in Florida, where I'm from, as they do in Latvia. This is a sombering slide, because this is an assessment that looks at soft skills and outcomes in a way that a lot of standardized testing does not. And what does this tell us about 15-year-olds who've spent a decade in our system? It tells us there's a crack in the armor here of the American education system. And if we believe education to be an economic driver in our country, what does this tell us about what's in the pipeline? Now, I don't want to leave you with just this wah-wah, so we'll talk a little bit more on positive notes, but I do want you to understand, when we understand the nature of the problem, the question you have to ask yourself is, does our district, does our school want to be the norm? Do we want to be the statistic, the average, or do we want to do something different? You guys remember Aaron Ralston? Got stuck between a rock and a hard place. Couldn't get out, was going to die, used a dull knife to cut his own arm off, and survived. When you get stuck in a rock and a hard place, you have to do something radically different if you are to survive. It can't be incremental. It can't be, let's tweak something that isn't working and maybe it will start working. You must fundamentally recognize you are in the rock and the hard place, and then you must be willing to change it. So what's the rock here? Well, I think the rock that we experience is that we have this shift that's occurred over time in a very short period of time from being sort of a culture and a country that makes their money using these to making our money using this. That doesn't mean that skilled labor is going to go away. We need our car worked on, we need plumbing. There is a place for vocational labor, always. And actually, they do better, yeah? Monetarily sometimes. But the idea is that the career skills that I've talked about that are necessary and the continuous lifelong learning, those are new sets of skills that are necessary for these students to be competitive in a global economy and to be competitive in that job market. So they need these new skills. But the second part of the rock or the hard place here is we have a very different generation that we are facing of digital natives. These students do not learn like I learned. They don't engage like I engaged. They're very different. And so there's a book written by a gentleman named Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat. Are any of you familiar with it? It's a good book. I took two major points away from it. The first one was any job that can be turned into a routine is going to either be automated or outsourced, right? The second thing was, and this was the one that really got my attention, 72% of the U.S. economy is based on consumer spending. What does that mean? Practically speaking, we're eating our seed corn. We are living off the success of innovation in the past and the creativity and the economic engine that was spawned by that type of creativity looking back. But what does that mean our future looks like? We have to be cognizant of a statistic like this and how it fits in context when so much is just based on spending and not innovation. So how about these kids? The ones that you are faced with teaching this coming year. Well, we call them born digital natives. The problem is that there is a pretty significant disconnect sometimes in education between them learning some of these skills like information gathering and critical thinking and the use of these technology tools, and then their ability to apply those because it's absent from so much of school curriculum. 63% of teachers nationally do not let their students use technology to create something in any given week. That's a big number. And so when we think about it, come to school, put down the technology, turn it off, we can't trust you with it anyway, and read this book. And we find that the students disengage fairly quickly in that type of environment. And I think the smoking gun here is we find that we have highly educated graduates that are fairly useless in terms of applying those skill sets to their environment as they come out and they begin to work. And it's not because they don't know how to use technology, is it? They can game. They can socially network. But using the technology as a tool in their environment and employment becomes a challenge. So there's a book written. It's called Hanging Out, messing around, and geeking out. It talks about 3 levels of student engagement. How do you start to engage these digital natives? And so it's a book that's actually written by 20-something authors that performed research over a period of 3 years. And it really identifies 3 levels of engagement with this crop of Generation Y digital natives. The first one is this level of hanging out. Now, kids have hung out since the dawn of time. In my day, it was at a malt shop. What Eli didn't tell you about the championship I just won is it is age bracketed. I lied. I told him I was 65. I had to get a license, doctored up. Sometimes you get the license to be 21. I got the license for 65 so I could enter the old guy category. The hanging out behavior, though, is about developing broad relationships, right? About half-inch deep, 900 Facebook friends. And through this type of behavior, they begin to gravitate toward people that have similar interests to them. They don't even know if those are the interests that they're really interested in or passionate about. I liken it to when I decided to play a musical instrument in 6th grade. They had a fair, and they brought in all the instruments, and they were in a room about this size on tables, and you could walk around and pick up the trumpet and the trombone and the saxophone. I knew I didn't want to play the flute. But beyond that, I was just sort of looking at a very broad range of opportunities. And then one of my friends was standing over by the trombones, and he was thinking about being a trombone player. So guess what we decided to do together? We decided to be trombone players. And it was a social decision as much as it was for me to do anything because I liked him, he had an interest, I thought it was an interest I might enjoy. And so that type of hanging out behavior is going to happen in your classrooms. It's going to happen outside of your classrooms where students are engaging, but they're engaging really just in a curious look around. Now, if we leave them in that state, have we done our jobs in education? No. Because somebody who has an open, what is the purpose of an open mouth? To close on something eventually, right? And so as we move them to a second level of engagement, it's this messing around behavior, right? Messing around behavior is really about tinkering. Did you ever tinker? How many of you ever tinkered with tinker toys? Like 6 of us that are old enough to, I guess, tinker with tinker toys. Yeah? But the use of these tools now to start to explore interests, that's a second level of engagement, right? I YouTube it, I Google it, I join a group of people that are talking about it. I might not really ultimately do it. I might not really enjoy it, but I sure enjoy finding out about it. And I need time and space to do so. And if I fill every day of a student's time with things that allow for no tinkering, no time, no space, just to tinker, then I'm going to miss this level of engagement. And this is a necessary second step for this generation to begin to go deeper in engagement with something that they're passionate about. And so kind of the third level here that we talk about is geeking out, right? Geeks, people who are just passionate about something. And they enjoy it, they dig into it, they get their teeth sunk into it, they're on fire about that thing. And really, would the goal of education in many of our minds be accomplished if students came through school and walked out of school with one of these areas of passion, something they were sold out to become? And so when we see how social networking becomes used in that environment and technology tools, this is where I'm engaging experts. This is where I'm actually participating in the creation of new ideas. I'm rewriting rules at this level. Once I learned to play the trombone well enough, could I play something that wasn't on book? Sure. And so I became passionate about that. And that's something that we look for as a level of engagement with students. And so that would be kind of a third level that we engage. So the learning behaviors that fall out of this type of environment are the behaviors that you're talking about this week. Right? Friendship, peer-based type of learning, socially networked, integrated with personal creativity. That's what will work with this generation. That's what the research shows works well with this generation. And so I want us to kind of close out the formal time this morning thinking about how do we raise questions, to whom do we raise these questions to raise the bar for education? I think the answer is obvious, but it's not one that we intuitively go after. And it would be to ask the student themselves, how do I engage you? Do you realize that from the time you're in kindergarten to the time you're in 12th grade, you will spend 14,000 hours in a classroom? And we're not talking about half people that need to be built so that someday they can be a human being that's functional in society. We're talking about fully functional little units that will spend 14,000 hours of their lives in these spaces. And so wouldn't anybody think it a good idea to ask them, what would these spaces look like if they were going to engage you? So this video is short, but it's a video that really speaks to that question.
Would choose one thing, one part, one aspect of the space that would make them feel creative, and really go for it. Make it crazy. Invent this, and invent it in a way that you can tell the rest of our group. What does this space look like?
There's a volcano that shoots out soda, and you can set the dial to whatever soda you want.
It's a 6-story building.
So in the computer room, we'd have a bunch of desktops and laptops and docking stations for your iPads.
And on the first floor, it's a nature room.
Oh yeah, okay. And so every hour we decided that, so you know how it's 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, so every hour
We're gonna have fairies floating everywhere.
And 1 o'clock they'll say, it's 1 o'clock, and then they'll drop fairy dust.
I feel most creative in my room because it's really comfortable and it helps me focus.
For me, I like having music playing.
I definitely like having it quiet, but not silent. I like having some background noise like a waterfall would have, but not really loud or distracting.
I kind of prefer something that's it's fun around me and it kind of inspires me to work hard.
My favorite subject is writing, and I really need to be inspired to write. So I usually like going outside somewhere where I can it's not too noisy, but you can hear bird songs and the wind and stuff like that.
So what is important, it's specifically in this case, in their environment, to help them get excited, be creative, learn. So that's the question that I'm hoping we can work on today.
These are our bouncy balls that they can use for sitting, in addition to ergonomic kinds of chairs. So lots of options for seating.
A space where movement is encouraged, volume is encouraged and supported, where it's a lot more organic instead of a more traditional box, quiet.
We really wanted none of the rules to apply, so even the physical laws of gravity to not apply, so that they could have gravity defiance and levitation generation.
We don't have any real pets, but we do have an area where there are little cuddlies that they can nurture, or squeeze balls that they may need in order to get stimulated for some ideas.
One idea was every time you come in, right, this is all movable. You've got furniture, you have, very athletic, bouncy things for people to get their energy out, balls to be throwing, so, while you're coming up with ideas. But so no 2 times when a student enters, is it configured the same way? We talked about the power of surprise.
I just thought of something. There could be jetpacks on the bottom of your, like you could have a jetpack. You could fly up there, type on your computer, fly back down. No, I have a good idea.
And so the idea is not that we have fairies with fairy dust and jetpacks, but that we listen to the kinds of environments that would engage these students. I think the challenge for us is, do we really want to continue to build spare parts of a human computer? Is that really going to be the goal of our education system in the future? Or are we inspired to ask these students fundamental questions about their space, their environment, how to engage them, how to incorporate technology into what they do, and to teach them to use the tools within the context of soft skills that they need? What do we want for the future of our America and the country that we have? And it's too big a problem for us to solve at a high level. This is going to be a district by district decision. This is a classroom by classroom decision. So many classrooms are set up for the comfort of the teacher and the administrators, and not for the comfort of the students, not for their enjoyment, not for the 14,000 hours they'll spend there. And then we wonder how we disengage them. So my challenge to you is very simple. Enjoy your conference. Take very seriously the gift you've been given to engage students as their teachers. And help work with visionaries like Eli and others who would reform education in this nation, because it will lead us back to a path of prosperity and creativity. Or if left alone, I think we see the other path that's our option. So I appreciate being here this morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I think if there are any questions, there's a couple of mics set up for it. I don't know that I can answer them if you ask them, but I would effort that. So thank you for letting me be here.
Bill, I'll get the questions started for you and see if we have some others. One of the questions that I have is that you talked about individuals who are coming out of high school, coming out of college, entering your enterprise, that don't necessarily have these skills that they ought to have. What are some of the things that you're doing within the company to kind of re-engage this entrepreneurial spirit, this initiative for folks, whether they be in manufacturing floor, whether they be in sales or marketing? How do you get them kind of re-inspired? What kinds of things are you doing that we can learn from and take away?
I think people need to understand their place in context. If you just exist to punch a button, or you just exist to set an appointment, or you just exist to sell a piece of furniture, that's not a very inspirational existence. And so understanding how we connect as an organization to the greater opportunity. Our mission at our company is to give every community the opportunity to have a world-class learning environment. That's the piece that we can engage. I can't change curriculum, I can't necessarily change technology or practices out there, but I can give communities the opportunity to have a different kind of environment than the traditional environment they're used to. And so when we connect that vision for people, no matter what place in the organization they hold, they understand they're part of something that's bigger, and then we help them connect up that small piece, and then we ask them, hey, what could we do to accomplish this? So I think that constantly casting the vision. I didn't present a lot of new information this morning, but constantly reminding ourselves of the size of the mountain and the challenge, and constantly seeing and repainting the vision over and over and over again. Human beings need that. Every 30 days, they need the vision repainted if they're going to stay inspired. And so that's probably the core thing that we do, is continue to paint the vision over and over and over again. All right? Thank you. Appreciate it.
Another round for Bill Latham. I have to say, if that doesn't get you inspired for what the next few days are really all about, then you're probably in the wrong room. because I think that is just fantastic information. The ability to see it in terms of the education environment, to see it in terms of what corporations look like, to have gone through the system, to have made those changes that in terms of jobs, careers, life settings that Bill has done, I think really inspires me for what we're all about. So I want to thank him again for really setting the standard for what I think I2ED is all about.